Welcome back to another single malt review, and once again we're venturing out of single malt territory. This time we're off to Kentucky, yeehaw, for a spot of bourbon.
Yes, indeed. Something a bit more rooting, if not tooting, for us today. It's Elijah Craig. This one says small batch, but it's I think it's just Elijah Craig 12 years old with a different label, because it is, as it says, 12 years old on the back. And it might not be malt whiskey, but as bourbon, it's more important than you might think. So even if you don't think it's as interesting as malt whiskey, which it's not, let's be honest, you should still be familiar with it, because if we didn't have bourbon, we wouldn't have nearly as much Scotch. And I'll explain why that is a little bit later on. But first of all, let's see what some of this American corn liquor has for us. First off, it's really rather dark, which you would expect, because by law, all bourbon has to be matured in a completely fresh virgin oak cask. All American white oak, obviously, Quercus alba. And so all bourbon, young or old, is going to be very wood influenced. But because of the charring they put on the barrels, not too woody, if you get my drift. There'll be a lot of sort of caramel and vanilla, which is what they're going for to soften that rather harsh corn spirit, but there won't be too much oak on it.
Now, Elijah Craig was the first kind of really good bourbon I ever tried. That was some years ago. Now though, we've been kind of lucky. There's so much really good bourbon flooding the market, you can almost say it's like a bourbonic plague.
Or something to that effect. There is a lot more available, at least down where we are in the world. I'm sure if you're closer to the market, it's always been floating around. There's a lot of craft distilling going on now, sort of micro distilleries popping up in the States, producing presumably very interesting things. We're certainly not anywhere close enough to be able to buy those as yet, but we'll hold out hope. So let's have a wee look at what's in here. It's pretty strong, it's 47%. But we'll give it a go without water to start things off. Whew. Now that's very different. And actually quite prickly as well.
It's very rich vanilla honey flavours. The extremely strong, dark, almost bittersweet honey. Raw bush honey.
It's very sweet. It's very vanilla-y. And it's really spicy compared to a lot of malt whiskey.
Here, cloves and oranges. And it's definitely attracting many of the fruit flies.
The fruit flies are out in force today. That's not being bourbon guys, being whiskey guys. It's difficult to really approach this as technically as we would a malt whiskey, because although this is exactly the same cask that will probably in the future mature a Scotch whisky, because that's where they all come from, ex-bourbon casks, it really almost couldn't taste more different from a bourbon matured Scotch. There's similarities really only in the vanilla and the little bit of coconut, and I'm even having trouble tasting coconut in there. It's a very heavily toasted coconut, if any at all. So it's a really different facet of the bourbon cask we're seeing here, this sort of first fill.
There is also what you never get in Scotch, a kind of smokiness, not obviously the Scotch whisky, peat smokiness, but a charred timber smokiness, smoked wood.
A bit of char on the wood. Sort of a bitter edge to the smell.
Yeah. It's very smooth. Very sweet.
So, actually that's not so bad on the palate. It's not too strong. I think it's the hot weather is giving it a bit of a prickle on the nose because it's evaporating rather fast. But on the palate, it's certainly not too sharp. I'm not sure if I'd call it absolutely smooth in comparison to a 12-year-old malt whiskey, but I suppose it depends what you're used to. Again, it's extremely spicy. There's cinnamon, mace, not really anise, I was going to say anise. What am I thinking of? There's pepper as well. Quite a lot of that aromatic black pepper in there.
Even a little fennel seed.
That may have been what I was thinking.
Yeah, it's not quite aniseed, but it's veering that way without actually being there.
The vanilla is really quite deep and lingering, and there's more overt wood on the palate than there is on the nose. It was a bit difficult to smell it, but...
Yeah, and I'm no chemist, but there's definitely some chemistry going on there. So much thick, oily cling just hanging onto that glass. It's full of syrupy
Certainly
goodness.
has body. And of course the makeup is really rather different from malt whiskey. By law, there's a lot of laws associated with bourbon. Not that there isn't with Scotch whisky, that's a whole other kettle of ballparks there. But the various laws that make bourbon bourbon is, first of all, as I said, it has to be matured in a completely fresh oak cask that's never had anything else in it. They cannot be reused. And it has to be at least 51% corn in the mash. So they've all got, unless they've got fairly expensive industrial chemicals in there to do the starch conversion, they've all got a portion of malted barley in there, because that's what contributes the amylase enzyme which allows you to make liquor out of corn or potatoes or pumpkins or really whatever else you want, things that would not otherwise ferment because the starch is complex and locked up.
You can in fact get pure corn liquor. We may have one on a future episode. It is a thing, it's out there.
It's an experience.
Yes.
So bourbon is always at least half corn. It's usually a lot more, usually more like 70%, sometimes all the way up to 90%. There's usually a bit of rye, there's always a bit of malted barley between 10 and 5%, and sometimes there's wheat, although usually wheat bourbons are quite self-described, like Maker's Mark is probably the most famous wheat bourbon, and that's quite forward with saying that it's got wheat in it. So this one we'll say is probably the usual recipe. Right, I'm going to put a wee bit of water in just to see if that changes anything.
Yeah, this is perfectly drinkable without it. Even at a relatively high strength, it is very sippable.
That makes it just a little bit more toasty, actually. That char becomes a bit more lively in there. That smoothed it off a wee bit. You know, it's so strange because there's almost no fruitiness in there. One of the most dominant things of Scotch whisky is there's fruit that comes through, and it's certainly not lacking in flavour here, but it's such a completely different flavour. It's spice and it's honey and sweetness, but it's not fruit. There's no freshness there that you get in malt. It's quite interesting. As bourbons go, this is actually quite old. 12 years old is kind of Elijah Craig's thing. Not that Elijah Craig is a distillery. That's the other thing about bourbon. I'm probably going a bit long here, but there's so much to explain for such a complex thing. There's really only 4 or 5 big bourbon distilleries. I think maybe only 4 now, since one of them was shut down. And out of those, all of the bourbons is made. So there's very few distilleries, a great many brands. So this comes out of the Heaven Hill distillery, as does Heaven Hill bourbon, as does Fighting Cock bourbon, as does probably 10 other brands. So in terms of distillery character, it might be a bit difficult to pin down, or rather a bit too easy to pin down, because really, were we applying the Scotch whisky rules here, we're drinking Heaven Hill bourbon here. It's just been treated a bit differently. So it's a weird thing, really. We'll have to get a few more and see if we can make a comparison between 2 different distilleries, see if there really is much of a difference there. Anyway, I'm not really sure what I should give this. It'll be our first bourbon score as well, so it'll mean really not a great deal until we review another one, but I'd say this is probably, let's go with a 79. I'd say it's fairly good quality bourbon. It should be. It's a more expensive bourbon and it's an older bourbon. But without any point of comparison, I'll just have to put my mark there and see if I have to update it later. What do you think?
Well, I've had in the past my kind of gold standard best bourbon ever against which all other bourbons will be judged. Sadly, this is not it, but it is still really good. This one I'll give around 85.
That's pretty solid. We will have to try and hunt another one down, and if you know of a good bourbon, you know, the must-try bourbon, the bourbon to which other bourbons should be marked against, then let us know, and that'll help us out immensely, because then we'll have a good flagpole to score things off. At any rate, this has been another episode of the Single Malt Review. Thank you for watching, and we will be right back with, I think, another Scotch whisky this time. Too much of this foreign nonsense on the channel. Slanger.